every fund, especially institutional investors, be it at seed stage or at a growth stage, at a later stage, they will want certain rights for sure.
If I were setting up a company or if I was starting a business, I would want to have, let's say, a male co-founder who understands the different stages in a woman's life.
My today's guests bring deep experience from Shadil Amachan Mangadas and Co., India's leading, most respected full-service law firm. Women actually drive 80% of consumer spending and get 2% of funding, which is crazy. Like, women are actually investors.
Yeah.
Because they like investing so much in
the economy,
right?
As a transaction lawyer, you want to make the deal happen. So that's always the exciting factor.
Like, a lot of times when we're representing investors or in general in transactions, you see there are a lot more women also at the table.
Welcome to Control All Thrive podcast with Navneet, where technology meets purpose and impact. Joining me, Bhargava KS, partner at the firm who has over 17 years of experience in venture capital and private equity transaction, including domestic and foreign investments, control acquisitions, fund formulation, real estate, and corporate advisory. Also joining me, Mithila Hari, principal associate at the firm with nearly 10 years of experience. She works closely with Bhargava and plays a key role in guiding clients to complex investment and corporate structures. Hi Bhargava, hi Mithila. Welcome to Control All Tribe. How are you doing today?
Hi Navneet, doing good. How about you?
Very well, thank you.
Hi Navneet, happy to be here.
Great. Tell me more about your background and what inspired you to got into startup and corporate law.
So I have been practicing for almost 10 years now in the PVC sector. I think maybe right out of college, I didn't really know this is what I wanted to do. But then as I worked in this field over the years, I realized that it's pretty amazing, and it always is a great feeling when you see like target companies get that investment and that funding, and you see them grow over the years. And a lot of times in the last 10 years, you start off with some investments at a seed stage, and then it slowly builds and builds and builds and builds, and then they grow. That's very nice to see.
So I was born and brought up in a small village in the Malnad region of Karnataka, Western Ghats region. So, and probably post class 10, that's when I decided, okay, let me try being a lawyer. That's what it is. And in law, there is always two sectors, if you may say. So litigation and non-litigation, and chose non-litigation, started with the firm. But what gives me kick is, as a transaction lawyer, you want to make the deal happen. So that's always the exciting factor in every transaction every day.
How to set up a company in India? What is the basic startup framework?
So you can set up an entity even before the company, probably in three forms. You can have a sole proprietorship, then you have either a partnership or an LLP, and then a company.
Right.
If it's a company, then you need to have minimum two shareholders and two directors, and the service start. Some people we see quite often, some founder, they started as a LLP and then convert that into a company. So the basic difference is that setting up of an LLP is quite easy, as well as if you want to wind up uh, in an unfortunate scenario, then again that's compared to a company, it's a bit hassle free. However,
Right.
setting up of a company is, while it's easy, winding up is not an easy. So as even on the regular compliances also, compared to company, LLP is quite less. However, when it comes to investments, attracting investments, companies are the preferred options for the investors. The reason is,
Only for startups, right?
yes, definitely for startups, and that's where we see most of the startups. I mean, I can say 99.99% that they have been set up as a companies, and they are being set up as companies. They're to private limited companies, and attract investments. That's what it is.
No, that's great. And Mithila, since you work very closely with Bhargava, and what are the common mistakes you see founders making?
some of the common, and I wouldn't call them mistakes, but I think some of the things that the founders could probably focus on is, from a legal aspect, is being pretty well compliant with your secretarial filings that you do with the registrar of companies,
Right.
and also maintaining a database of these documents. So what happens is, obviously most founders may not have legal background or legal knowledge on what exactly it takes to set it up, and then what forms are required to be filed, within what timelines these forms have to be filed with the government authorities.
Right.
So I think there's some lapse there, maybe, where obviously for a founder, at the outset, I think they don't give too much importance to some of these aspects, and they're focusing more on the business, rightly so. But I think this is where sometimes you see a lot of the initial compliance, secretarial compliances that are required to be maintained by companies are not in order. So I think that would be one of the key mistakes that founders make at the get-go.
And what about on nonprofit? A lot of founders who just want to do, like in terms of work in advocacy or social work, right? Um, and they just don't know how to set up the nonprofit part. Nonprofit is so difficult.
Okay, two aspects. Non-profit, you can set it up as a society or a trust actually with the charitable or non-profit objective, or you can also set it up as what we call Section 8 company, which is again recognized. That is a non-profit company itself. What we call Section 8 company under the Companies Act. Okay, so that we see in all three forms. In fact, many of the NGOs today, in fact, they are not Section 8 companies, rather they are trust or a society in that form. And if for a trust, it need not be registered also. Registration, it's optional actually. Okay, so that's what it is. And there, the mainly the compliance part, if it's a trust or society, is quite less compared to a company again. And it's mainly on the accounts, which will have to be audited every year by a chartered accountant, and some of the filings with the registrars is what is required, and the tax filings. When it comes to attracting on the capital contribution,
I was just gonna coming back to that. Yes.
yes, so domestic wise, it's quite easy to attract domestic contribution to be it Section 8 or trust or society. However, when it comes to taking foreign capital or contribution, okay, the FCRA, Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, will come into picture, and the registration is necessary, and the compliances including filing returns, use of proceeds, etc. So some of those conditionalities will have to be met, and that's bit of course that was there always, but it is being strictly enforced. We have seen strict enforcement of that in the last couple of years, in fact, because there were reported instances of misuse of this so-called foreign contribution for
Right.
certain non-social.
Would
I
you also
related
consider as grants, right?
yes, that nothing but grant, a kind of contribution. So for attracting foreign capital or contribution or grant, the compliance with FCRA is quite important, and that should not be ignored.
Right.
And of late, it's quite stringent as well in terms of its enforcement, and checking whether returns have been filed or not. The concerned government authorities are following up quite rigorously.
Coming back to now startups, and I want to touch upon the topic which I see that a lot within co-founders. We've seen, I mean, of course, your partner or your co-founder can make and break your company, right? And how do you choose the right person is also really important. Plus, how do you set up the legal framework in terms of splitting the equity part?
Yeah.
And how do you decide that, when someone's new who's actually doesn't know the process, because we get so excited about the idea, but we just don't think of long term. And that's why, like, at the early days, there's so many of these mistakes happens, right? Yeah.
What we mostly see is equity being split equally.
Right.
And in the beginning, when the company is being set up, the value of the shares is very, very nominal. So we typically see an equal equity split between all the founders coming in.
Just to supplement what Mithila is saying, right? And you made an interesting point on founders should have that meeting of minds when they decide and
Right.
figure out is that person is the right person. I mean, here I want to give an interesting story. So we were advising a startup. It was 2 years plus. It was started by two particular founders.
Right.
Okay, they were holding about 50%, and they decided to onboard another founder in year close to year two when it was a fintech company. Their product about to be launched. Okay, and that founder was so then they thought, okay, fine, let it be 30 one third each for each of the founder. So then what happened was the third founder was quite aggressive in terms of hiring and marketing and cash burn. So which was not liked by the other two founders, which resulted in the exit of one of the initial founders, and subsequently the company went into distress as well. So I mean, choosing a right founder, having an agreement, or at least you know what the plan is, what how the journey should be for the next couple of months.
100%.
That's the most important aspect when you're choosing a founder. I mean, this I've seen from incorporation till the end of the company actually.
Yeah. Do you also see that when the companies are growing, actually, when they go like growth stage, let's say Series A to
We have seen instances where companies which are in say in Series C or Series D or Series F fundraise stage, also Series F also, you know, where one of the founder wants to take a non executive role or more as a non-active role or more a passive role and want to step down from the executive role and say, okay, fine, enough for me. This is fine. I'll be with you all, but you know, I'll not be actively involved.
yeah,
We have seen those
contribution will
instances.
be less. Yeah.
Yeah, but those are more like more cordial separation, if I may say so.
Yeah.
Okay. But we have seen those instances. It's not that it's unheard of.
Right.
Just to add to that, I think companies which are at a stage where they're at a Series F or G or
Yeah.
are just about pre-IPO typically are more professionally managed companies. So you already have professionals that are handling.
structure.
Yes, yeah, they have a proper management structure in place. So it's easier, like for founders to take a step back. I would say so at that point in time. But yeah,
But in early
it's
stage, it's not
yeah.
that easy actually.
Yeah.
Transition will not be easy. And it affects the company a lot. So choosing the right founder is the key.
Yes. And of course, like also setting the foundation, which is at early stage, right? Like you never know your company can become so big also, and you don't want to have these complications later, which probably wouldn't be good for investors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're gonna actually do a lot of basics in this conversation. So I don't want to make it complicated. Like anyone's listening, they can understand basics of it. So what are the legal documents needed when you're raising like seed round?
I think the first thing is obviously once you identify potential investors, it's best to enter into a non-binding sort of term sheet that sets out the broad principles or the broad structure of the investment by these potential investors. Basis which you then typically have your securities subscription agreement and a shareholders agreement. Without going into too much detail, a securities subscription agreement typically deals with the terms of the investment by the investors itself. So that would include the kind of securities that the company is going to issue to them, what would be the investment amount, and what are the conditions that the company and founders have to undertake in order to, sort of facilitate this investment by the investors. A shareholders agreement typically includes the rights and obligations of the different shareholders of the company. More specifically, I think when a startup starts raising funds, it would typically govern the rights available to the investors in the company. And it's very important to have these documents in place, well drafted and put together so that there is no room for sort of any confusion later on. And all of these rights and obligations are clearly set out. Sometimes investors also ask for the founders to execute employment agreements in with certain clauses that are that the investors expect to be there. For example, your non-compete, your non-solicitation, who owns the IP, and
Right.
typically governs this. Separately, like when you talk about the fundraise itself or the investment round itself, I think one of the important things that, and you would see most institutional investors would undertake a legal due diligence before they actually
Yeah.
invest in the company. So I think it's very important then for the company to sort of, maybe have a database of all the documents that typically would be reviewed from a legal due diligence perspective right from the beginning.
Yeah. I also see that many founders getting stuck at due diligence process, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think so? What are the mistakes maybe they're making and like how to be strong in that process?
So I think there are two aspects to this. I think one is actually keeping a database of the documents and sort of preempting what would be asked in a legal due diligence. And the other aspect of it is the non-compliance bit itself.
Right.
So the first bit, I think, is just until I think founders actually get to that stage where they're raising funds from investors, don't probably understand the amount of forms and other documents and licenses and other things that have to be obtained. Number one.
Right.
Number two, even if someone in the company has been obtaining this, I think maintaining it or having copies of this in one place would really help, because then that just fastens the legal due diligence process.
Right.
The second part of it is, like I was saying earlier, right? I think a lot of times there's not much importance given to secretarial filings and things like that until at least you get your seed investor. It's when you do that first round of due diligence that founders typically understand, okay, there is so much that we actually need to comply with, there's so much that you need to do, and that's when I think it gets a little more streamlined. And this is very normal, this is what you see in the market all the time.
Right.
But having that right from incorporation actually makes it so much more easier to raise funds.
Yeah. And I think Bhargava, for you, like you work with investors and startups both, right? And you also help formulation of so many funds, right? So I want to ask you, like, how do you best negotiate with investors?
A tough question, but yeah, great answer. So two aspects to this, right? One is in terms of, you touched upon the part of equity and dilution, how much, etc.
Right.
That's one, and on the other aspect relating to the protection. I think on the aspect relating to equity, how much dilution, etc. That's more as a commercial aspect, but one thing what we have observed in many of the startups is, rather when they from seed to series A or series B, promoters have diluted themselves a lot, too much
Right.
dilution at a very early stage, maybe because of the pressure to raise money or other market driven aspects.
Right.
Don't know, but that is what we have seen. I mean, in many cases we see that companies still at series A stage, but promoters are below 50% or 40%.
100%.
Then till for the next phase of the journey, that is the growth phase, what we call, right, then promoters will be less than 30% or 20% actually.
Right.
So if it's for a very less amount of quantum of capital, too much dilution may not be so good. But
Right.
at the same time, it really depends on circumstances, and it differs from case to case basis.
Totally. But what do you think, like, for 1 million, what should be the
Again, it's the valuation factor, right? There is no hard and fast rule, to be very frank with you.
I actually read on LinkedIn last week that one founder just gave 20% for 1 million and they made like the company's now like worth 1 billion and all that. I mean, of course, that's too much to give.
I think it's the same post where I read one person has indicated what should be the dilution at each stage, kind of a thing. I think we have read the same post probably. It also depends on how much money the promoter will want or how desperate the promoter is.
Yeah. And do you also see differentiator between consumer brands and tech companies?
Yes. Yes. It also okay, the factor is the aspect of how fast you can start generating revenue also will have a play, right? So
Totally. Yeah.
that's also the case actually. Yeah. Are you a consumer facing, or are you a tech which supports and which fits into some other product and supports? So that also depends actually.
Yeah.
So I think too many aspects will be into play when it comes to the valuation.
Usually you won't give the numbers.
And no, definitely no. It won't be possible. But when it comes to negotiation, I think there are a couple of things, right? Every fund, especially institutional investors, be it at seed stage or at a growth stage, or at a later stage, they will want certain rights for sure. Be it, as Mithila mentioned, be it indemnity under a subscription agreement towards the capital what they're putting in, or governance in terms of veto matters, exit promise, etc. Right? You can never say no to those aspects. However, you we what if I'm arguing for, if I'm negotiating on behalf of a promoter, we need to try to protect certain of the aspects, like how a promoter should not be replaced easily, or he should not be, his employment should not be terminated, or directorship should not be terminated for no reason. So there are some, we can always try to provide checks and balances,
Yeah.
so that even if there is a separation, that's based on certain reasons, and certain process is followed before that particular separation. So that's the thing. And always can provide for, or ask for certain things, like ask for a small liquidity at a
Right.
series A stage or bit later stage, maybe bit too much at a seed level itself. Promoter cannot expect a liquidity. Investor rather would want promoter to hold full shareholding in the company,
Right.
and try to grow value for himself as for the and the entire cap table. So some of these aspects will come into play.
Yeah. And Mithila, I want to ask you, like, of course, there's a lot of gender bias, of course, in overall tech world or startup world and business world. Um, I absolutely believe in diverse teams for sure.
Yeah.
But do you think that, um, like, have you ever noticed that, yeah, because male founders are more equity than female co-founders? Or
So not really. No, I haven't seen that, at least in the 10 years of my practice. I think it's evolving now. It's changing quite a bit. I don't think there's that discrimination anymore, or at least, I mean, I think I've just been lucky enough not to see that
that's really good.
happen. Yeah. So there have been companies, or we've invested investors who are putting in money into certain startup seed stage companies, where we see both the male and female founders are, let's say, there was this one company that we were looking at, where both of them were doing some research in a pretty spectacular field of technology. And it was interesting to see that the female actually had like a 51% stake and the male had a 49% stake. So that made me quite happy. But I think that bias is not no longer there as much.
Right. Yeah. So I also heard so many stories that women are like, hey, we've just like, raised funding. I raised 20 million of funding and I'm not part of the cap table anymore. They removed me, or she's like, I don't want to fight back because I have family, I have kids and all that. There are stories like this. And of course, I'm not saying that that only happens because you're a women founder. No, there are so many other things could be part of the company as well. Like, your role as a founder and how much time are you giving, and overall structure of the company, right?
But I think that sort of circles back to the same thing, right? Like, yeah, you find the right co-founders. Like,
100%.
I think as a woman, if I were setting up a company or if I was starting a business, I would want to have, let's say, a male co-founder who understands the different stages in a woman's life, be it motherhood or marriage or whatever it is. I think it circles back to that. And also finding the right investors. I mean, most investors are reasonable. Most investors are going to be understanding of all of this. And, um, so again, that's just very important that you find the right mindset with your co-founders.
Yeah. So there's nothing specific as a gender, I believe, right? Like there are like so many other elements overall.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that's also true that women actually drive 80% of consumer spending and get 2% of funding,
Yeah.
which is crazy. Like I'm always like, all the women are actually investors.
Yeah.
because they're like investing so much into
the
economy, right? But why do we get such a less funding? What do you, because like you work closely with startup with many companies, like
Yeah.
of course, you can't mention the names, but your portfolio includes some of the biggest companies, right? And
Yeah.
why do you think so? What is your perspective overall? Because I hear this a lot. Like we always have this conversation,
Yeah.
but I feel in India it's less because in India, like of course, the entire ecosystem is treated like it's not treated based on gender.
Yeah.
It's treated based on the value you bring on, like
Yeah.
your product or what you're building, right? But what do you think as per your experience?
So, like I said, like, I have not seen too much of a bias in the startup community at all in the last 10 years. I'm not, again, I cannot speak for what it was like before that, but
Yeah.
I think the time that I have been in this space, I honestly haven't seen too much of this bias. So, I've never had a scenario where we're advising a company, let's say representing a company, and there are female co founders and have faced problems like this. Um, it's always been, or we've always noticed that the experience that men and women have as co-founders have more or less been the same.
Yeah.
On the contrary, I would probably like maybe say that women also get a lot more preference these days as
Yeah.
opposed to the men,
Yeah. I mean, which is very good. Like,
which is nice. It's
And to supplement to what she's saying, I think the other supporting factor is that this is a very sophisticated community, be it
yeah,
right.
institutional investors or angel investors or HNIs and the founders are startup community, right? Very sophisticated. I think that is another helping factor in terms of that there is no gender discrimination or discrimination on the basis of gender.
Yeah.
I think you also see a lot of women in senior positions at the institutional investors management level itself. Like, a lot of times when we're representing investors or in general in transactions, you see there are a lot more women also in, at the table and having these conversations. So I think because even at the investor level, there's more women representation. I just feel like, this entire bias between men and women when it comes to founders is not there, is no longer there.
And Bhargava, if we can touch upon this, that how should companies protect their confidential information and trade secrets?
Okay, couple of things here. One is vis-a-vis where employees or consultants whom you hire at the early stage have robust non-disclosure and confidentiality protection agreements, including IP assignment clauses in the employment agreement or employment letter what you offer, so that
Right.
tomorrow he cannot come and claim uh, ownership over such intellectual property that is developed. Second one is when you are sharing the information with a third party, just be sure
Right.
who he is or who she is or which entity that is, kind of a thing, so that you don't want to share too much information with an
100%.
unwanted person. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
uh, so I mean, there is always risk in sharing information. You can't,
Yeah.
sharing information comes with its own risk. This is one of the risk, but at the same time you will have to share. Say for example, if it's a pitch deck, you may have to share with employees. They will know. So all you can do is to take measures proactively to ensure that tomorrow if something happens, you have enough paperwork to
100%.
fight it legally,
Yeah.
which helps a litigation lawyer, my colleague.
Yeah. So I think since we were talking about the, the company structure and legal part, and of course, at early stages, you hire so many people and you fire also so many people, right? How should startup structure offer letter, NDAs, and other stop option agreements?
Okay. I think one, what we've noticed with startups is that when they're initially hiring and firing people, I think one of the things that they do is just stick to issuing offer letters or appointment letters and, just a one-pager document saying, okay, this is your CTC and this is,
Right.
your leave policy, etc. I think what startups and founders can do from an early stage is actually, prepare like a template, like with the help of a counsel or someone who knows the law, prepare like a template of an employment agreement itself that has provisions and that has clauses with respect to like confidentiality of information, that
Right.
non-compete, non-solicitation, ownership of IP. These are clauses that would actually bind the employees, and contractually, the employee would be bound not to share all of the confidential information, or any IP that's produced by the employee during the course of employment would belong to the company. Um, Sometimes there are non-compete provisions that where, for a certain period of time, they don't engage in a competing business. These are some of the provisions that could be included in an employment agreement, as opposed to, just doing a one-pager document, have something that's more robust.
Right.
And the other practice that comes along with this is to have stamp duty paid on these employment agreements, at the time of execution of the same. I think this is something that could be put into place that would just sort of, like Bhargava was saying, leave a paper trail enough for a litigation lawyer to sort of,
Yeah.
fight it out in court if needed. But having these agreements and these clauses be binding on employees, I think from the beginning is a good practice.
No, I think that's a really good point.
I would think one of the instances where we faced, or rather, we've seen where not a client, but my investor was my client was an investor in a particular company, which when they tried to file a patent, they realized that one of their ex-employees had not assigned and there was no assignment clause. So he objected to the application and it went into litigation. So they realized a
Right.
bit late in the day. So a proper paperwork would always help.
Since we were talking about the foundations of the company and we talk about exit and acquisitions, right? What legal groundwork should be laid um, for early on to make a future acquisition smoother?
So I think compliances being in place is the key thing. Second one is that is the regulatory aspect. Okay. Second one is, especially in a company which is IP heavy, uh, you have enough IP protection and ownership of IPs with the company. That's something, and related paperwork is proper. That's something which is absolutely necessary, because that's what the investor would value, or the acquirer would value, right? So that's the thing. But coming to exit scenarios, that's always evolving. Today you can't predict as to how the exit would be. It could be, obviously, exit will be 4 or 5 years down the line, or 7, 8 years down the line. It could be by way of listing of your securities, or strategic M&A activity kind of a thing, right? So uh, having proper compliance is the key. I think that's what the acquirer will look into it, or at the listing stage there will be a diligence. So that's the key.
I want to ask you this question for global companies. What are the like 4 key points they have to consider when they think of, coming to markets like India?
One, I think, would be depends on the sector that they're looking to comply with, right? Invest in, right?
Right.
It would be very important because while FDI is permitted in India, some of the sectors, there are approval requirements, and some of the sectors also have how much a foreign entity can hold in that particular sector in a particular company. So I think the first and foremost, the aspect that these global companies would have to take into account is that sector even permitted, or does that sector permit you to hold FDI, right? If the answer to that is yes, then of course, from a legal perspective, I think a lot of the times what would typically um, what we would typically recommend is, you do a thorough legal due diligence of the target entity. And again, that sort of ties back to what I was saying about founders right from the beginning, having this database and having all your documents in place. So I think that's sort of what most companies would look at, like the sector, and is FDI permitted in that sector, and also like, is the company in general compliance with all the local laws or all the laws that are relation to the product, relation to the sector
Right.
locally.
Do you have anything to add on?
No, I mean, this is in addition to the commercial aspects which the global companies would consider, be it, compatibility with the founders, product market reach, etc. I think that's it.
Right. So I have this personal question as well, that since you set up a lot of funds in India, why do you think so there are very less female investors? Like,
Fundraising is not an easy activity with be it men or women. I mean, because you'll have to gain confidence of the LPs and then you have to return the
100%.
capital and
Yeah.
everything, right? So be it India or elsewhere, wherever it is, it's not an easy activity. But I hope that changes.
Yeah. I say that in global, yeah, there's so many like women-owned fund, but in India it's still growing. But I definitely see that yes, more women are stepping up. Of course, it's really happy to see that more women are becoming part of the fund, like, as the teams, right? So the funds are now led by diverse teams,
Yeah.
which is so good. I have a last question, of course. What's your message for any founder, young founder who's listening? And if you can, give like 3, 4 top points that what they can look up when they actually dreaming of starting something or scaling or maybe just thinking to do something big.
Okay, let me add a story or an experience that we also had while giving you an answer to this question. Again, we were representing an investor in this scenario, and the company that they were investing into, there was an issue that came up in the due diligence with respect to their capital structure. While the issue, if you explain it to a non-lawyer, would be it's just a few words not written in some documentation. But the consequence or the penalty for that would be pretty severe, where, the investor had to actually rethink whether they want to put investment into this company where there is a potential liability or risk. That mistake or that lack of having those few words could have actually been very easily avoided if you had a good company secretary advising you right at the beginning. So the story there was that they had to actually set up a new company and move their business and then fix the capital structure, have that documentation properly in place. But just saying, like I was saying and I have said before, I think one of the first few things from a legal aspect at least is to have like a really good company secretary in place right at the beginning, so a lot of these troubles would be avoided in the future, and then when it actually comes to fundraise, everything is in place and like the diligence goes smoothly and the investment actually goes through.
While unfortunately India has a heavy compliance requirements under law, unlike probably a Delaware company or some of the US jurisdictions. Okay, these are not my words, but this is what I advise. Okay, borrowed rather. Uh, Cost of compliance is always lesser than cost of rectifying a non-compliance.
Yes.
So to the extent possible, be compliant.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights. I'm sure a lot of people and founders who are listening, they can take key takeaways, or people who are just thinking of starting their own companies as well.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you for having
having us over here.